Good morning. What I find particularly interesting this morning is this might be the most Easter-like Easter observation that you'll ever undertake in your life. On that first Easter morning, where do we find the disciples? They're in a room somewhere in Jerusalem, locked down. They're in isolation. So in a very real way, as we observe Easter in isolation, we're entering into a small aspect of what it was like on that first Easter morning. It wasn't a celebration filled with joy and pomp and circumstance like it is today, but they were pondering what went wrong. Why was Jesus killed? And they were scared that they might be next. What I want to look at today is perhaps the earliest and the strongest evidence for the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. And no, it's not in the Gospels. But before I get to that, we need to refill our coffee. Good morning, my name is David Paris, and for the past 30 years, I've been involved in graduate level theological education, both teaching and doing research. And in these videos, what I hope to do is to bring some of what I've learned on that journey into these videos so that you can learn from my experiences. So if you find these videos helpful, be sure you subscribe somewhere down over here, I think, and tell others about them as well. In The Historian's Craft, Mark Bloch argues that Christianity was a religion of historians. The nature of the Christian faith places humanity in the middle of a long journey from fall to judgment. And it's in this long journey that the history of the great drama of sin and redemption is unfolded, the central axis of Christian thought. Today, what I want to do is look at one very small 30 to 40 year slice of that journey. So let's take a look at some of the main events that take place after that first Easter morning in the New Testament. The first event we can place pretty easily. Jesus was crucified and raised from the dead in 33 AD, the first Easter. But when do we have the first record of this? We need to do a little detective work in the New Testament to piece this together. In order to do this, we need to place a couple historical markers on our timeline. The first is in 35 AD. This is when Paul most likely has his Damascus Road experience. In 44 AD, Barnabas then goes to Tarsus and retrieves Paul. In 48 AD, Paul and Barnabas depart Antioch and go on the first of many missionary journeys. Because of the sudden influx of Gentiles into the church as a result of that first missionary journey, a council is called in Jerusalem to determine how to handle this. And their decision set the bar about as low as it could go for the Gentiles. In 50 AD, shortly after the council in Jerusalem, Paul sets out on his second missionary journey. And it's during this trip that he plants the church in Corinth. A year after he returns home from that, he sets out on his third missionary journey. On his third missionary journey, in 52 AD, that he writes the letter 1 Corinthians. A few years later, let's say around 55 AD, the Gospel of Mark is written. About 63, or about 10 years later, Paul is arrested and imprisoned in Rome. It was during this time that Luke writes his Gospel in the book of Acts. And then around 65 AD, Matthew was written shortly after 65 AD, probably before 75 AD, so about a 10-year window for Matthew's Gospel. And then from 70 AD to around 80 AD, John writes his Gospel down. Now what this means is that most of Paul's letters were written before Matthew, Luke, and John were written, and probably at least half of them before Mark is written. A lot of people assume that because Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John come first in the New Testament, they were written first and then Paul's letters later. They're placed first in the New Testament to give prominence to the life of Jesus Christ, not based on the chronology of when they were written. So where does this leave us today? In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul quotes a creed about the resurrection. Now this creed that he quotes is even older than his letter. So let's take a look at the first 9 verses in chapter 15 of 1 Corinthians. And in the process, I'm going to point out a few things in the text there that help us date it. And I'm going to show you why this is the earliest account of Jesus' resurrection. Now, Paul opens 1 Corinthians 15 by emphasizing how important this creed that he's about to quote is. He uses words like, I want you to know, I want to remind you, or I want to make clear. This is how some of the different English translations translate this. Now, linguistically, this is known as a metacomment. It's like having an argument with someone, and they point their finger at you and they say, let me tell you something. In verses 1 and 2, you can see the importance that Paul places upon what he's about to say to them. Look at all the verbs that he uses here. I preached to you, you received, in which you stand, you hold firm. The message I preached to you, this is the second time he used this, unless you believed in vain. In verse 3, he uses 2 verbs that are rather technical in nature. He says, I passed on what I received. Now, these 2 verbs are often used in sort of a teaching situation. Teachers within the Greco-Roman schools would use this. They would use it within the rabbinic schools or different religious traditions. The idea here is that someone received something. It means it was taught to them and they memorized it word for word. When they pass it on, they make sure that the person they're teaching it to memorizes exactly word for word. And when he uses the word that, this is sort of like a quotation mark in Greek, and this is letting you know that this is the start of the creed. Now, what we miss when we look at this structure in the English text is the way it's laid out in our text. We miss the way this creed is laid out in stanzas. And so what I want to do is take a look at that so that you can actually see the structure of what's going on in the text here. So let's look at verses 3 through 7. Quote now starts with, Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures. Now let's move this from sort of a sentence or a verse layout into a stanza layout so you can see the structure of this. Now when we do this, you can see that it breaks down into a very nice little stanza structure. The first thing I want you to notice here is that this creed is really structured around just 4 verbs. Died, buried, raised, appeared. These 4 verbs express the most basic elements of the creed of the resurrection. Another point here for you to note is this phrase, on the 3rd day. Now that makes perfect sense in English, but the Greek behind this is bad. In fact, the different Greek grammarians during that time often use a structure like this to show how someone who doesn't know the language or how someone who's uneducated would structure this. However, if we translate this phrase back into Hebrew or Aramaic, it becomes much better grammatically. Now, this most likely reflects that this creed originated in Palestine within either the Hebrew or the Aramaic-speaking church. Another example of this is Cephas. This is the name for Peter. Now, once the church spreads outside of Israel, Peter is no longer known as Cephas. He goes by the nickname that Jesus gave him, Petros, or Peter. Once again, this reflects the early Palestinian origin of this creed. The use of appeared here, which occurs several times in the passage, is passive in Greek. It's the verb to see. It conveys the idea that Peter and the other people listed in the creed here saw Jesus, but it's in the passive form. This brings across the idea that Jesus made himself to be seen by them or let himself be seen by them. It's an indication that there's a divine revelation taking place in these appearances of Jesus to them. The 500 who witnessed this is not mentioned in the Gospels or the book of Acts. This is the only place that we find it. And once again, it probably reflects this creed being originated in Jerusalem. The basic idea here is if you don't believe the creed or you have doubts about it, you can go talk to one of these 500. Most of them are still alive to this day. So let's see how we pull all this together, both the timeline at the beginning and the aspects from the text that I looked at. First off, Paul is writing this letter in 52 AD. That's our starting date. At the start of this creed, he said, I delivered to you what I received. That means he had to have passed it on to them in 50 AD when he was visiting them on his second missionary journey. Now, in all likelihood, Paul taught this same creed on his first missionary journey, so we can back this up to around 48 AD. Now we're faced with a question where we have to do a little bit of reasoning here. How early do we move this creed? Now, if Paul is converted around 35 AD and he moves into a position of leadership at the Church of Antioch in 44 AD, we have a time window there that we need to figure this out in. The Hebrew or Aramaic elements of this text indicate that it originally came from Jerusalem. So we need to ask the question then, how long does it take a creedal statement like this, probably originally a poem, to be accepted as an authoritative teaching within the church? A lot of the New Testament scholars that work on these creeds feel that it falls somewhere within 3 to 8 years. The second question that we need to ask is, how long would it take to go from Jerusalem all the way up to Antioch, some 350 miles away? So it has to overcome actually 3 boundaries: distance, language, and religious culture to reach there. They feel that it would have taken probably 3 to 4 years to go from Jerusalem to Antioch and be accepted as authoritative within the Greek-speaking church, because remember, it has to be translated into Greek and accepted by them as well. So, where does this place this? We've backed this thing up to about 44 AD. So if we take 3 to 4 years for it to gain authoritative status, that puts it around, let's say, 39 to 41. And if it takes another 3 to 5 years for it to be accepted as an authoritative text within the church in Jerusalem, then that backs this text up somewhere between 35 to 30 AD. That's a good 17 years before the Gospel of Mark is written and 30 years before Matthew or Luke are written. It places this creed that Paul's writing within 2 to 6 years of Jesus' death and resurrection. If you think back to the Great Recession that occurred under President Bush in 2008, we all remember what that was like, and we remember what it was like to try and get out of that. Now that was 12 years ago. This creed is within 2 to 6 years of Jesus' resurrection. That gives this creed a great deal of historical veracity. This is a very strong historical record of Jesus' resurrection. This is an event that changed the world, but it had such humble beginnings. The disciples are gathered in a room, afraid of what they would confront if they went out into the world on that first Easter. After a service celebrating the resurrection, the ancient church on Easter Sundays would proclaim, Christos Anastai, Alithos Anastai, Christ is risen indeed. Peace be with you.